He was healthy. He was a seasoned general. He had just reached the pinnacle of power, President of the United States. And then exactly 1 month later, he was gone. No clear cause, no consensus among his doctors. At a death so sudden, so controversial, that nearly 2 centuries later, the autopsy of history is still being written. The year was 1841. America was young. Its power was fragile. The presidency was far more dangerous than anyone dared to imagine. This is the story of William Henry Harrison and the death that remains the White House's darkest secret. On Inauguration Day, Harrison made a choice that would haunt his legacy. The weather was brutal, freezing rain and bone-chilling winds. But Harrison wanted to prove his strength. He was 68, the oldest man elected at the time, and he had a point to prove. He refused a coat, he refused a hat, he refused gloves. For nearly 2 hours, he stood in the freezing dampness, delivering the longest inaugural address in U.S. history. The crowd cheered for his stamina. But the physicians watching from the shadows saw something else. They saw a man walking straight into a trap. Just days later, the Iron Man crumbled. A skyrocketing fever, rapid, shallow breathing, agonizing pain. The official verdict? Pneumonia. The doctors blamed that cold, wet day on the podium. But here's the problem. Modern medical science tells us that standing in the cold, while miserable, doesn't actually cause pneumonia. So what really caused his organs to shut down? What was the invisible killer lurking inside the executive mansion? At the time, the White House didn't have a modern sewer system. In fact, the city's sewage was dumped just blocks away, creating a stagnant marshland of bacteria. This night soil flowed dangerously close to the spring that supplied the president's drinking water. Historians now believe Harrison didn't die of a cold. He died of enteric fever, brutal infection from contaminated water. But why was the diagnosis buried? Because admitting the president died from drinking the water in his own home was a national security disaster. It was easier to blame the weather than to admit the White House was a death trap. On his final night, April 3rd, Harrison drifted into a fever dream. Witnesses claimed he was speaking to someone who wasn't there, whispering strange, urgent commands as if leading a phantom army. At 12:30 a.m. on April 4th, 1841, the lamps went out. The president was dead. He had served for only 31 days. The shortest presidency in history. A term that ended before it even began. There was no autopsy. The doctor's notes were a mess of contradictions. Some argued it was his lungs. Others said it was his stomach. The government moved quickly. Within days, John Tyler was sworn in. The nation moved on because it had to. The questions were swept under the rug, buried beneath the politics of a growing nation. Some theorists believe this wasn't just medical ignorance. They argue it was a calculated silence. If the American public knew their leader was killed by poor sanitation and government negligence, the trust in the brand new Capitol would have collapsed. The pneumonia narrative was convenient. It was a tragedy of nature, not a failure of the state. They sacrificed the truth to keep the peace. So, what really killed William Henry Harrison? Was it the vanity of a man in the cold? Was it the incompetence of 19th century medicine? Or was it a truth so grim that America simply wasn't ready to face it? One thing is certain. History doesn't always lie. Sometimes, it just stays quiet.